August 31st, 1957 was a historic day that Malaya, or now called Malaysia, gained independence from British rule. The pivotal announcement took place at Merdeka Stadium in Kuala Lumpur, where thousands of Malaysians gathered to cheer as Abdul Rahman, the Prime Minister of Malaya, proclaimed it a sovereign state. Yet, even though Malaysia was officially liberated from the hands of British rule, it would take decades for British influence to be fully eradicated from the country. But before we dive in, we need to know the historical background of independence movements that would ultimately lead to Malaysia's freedom. Resistance was not uncommon in the 19th century as local uprisings occurred in Pahang, Kelantan, and Terengganu from Malay nobles and their peasant followers. However, the 20th century is where resistance really becomes amplified. During World War II, Japanese forces had taken control of Britain's Southeast Asian possessions, including Malaya and Singapore. Although Britain eventually regained control, the damage had already been done. There was a loss of prestige and, by then, desires of self-rule had emerged. It was the beginning of the end of Britain's Asian Empire. To further desires of independence, Chief Minister Onn bin Jafar formed the United Malays National Organization, or UMNO, in 1946. This political party sought independence and promoted Malay interests, while leaving both Chinese and Indian Malays out of the conversation. Jafar argued that giving the economically dominant Chinese and Indians a part in the government would cause the extinction of the Malay race. Nonetheless, the UMNO succeeded in getting the British to discuss the future of Malaysia. In addition to the UMNO, the Malaysian Indian Congress, or MIC, was established in August of 1946 to fight for Indian independence from British rule in Malaysia. But what about the Chinese Malays? Well, in 1949, a group of wealthy businessmen founded the Malaysian Chinese Association, or MCA, a racial political party aiming to represent Chinese Malays. So we had all of these independence organizations, but what did they do with it? Now enter Malaysian statesman Abdul Rahman. He unites the UMNO, the MIC, and the MCA under an alliance to become the Federation of Malaya. Note that Singapore was originally part of this federation, joining in September of 1963, but it was expelled 2 years later due to social unrest and disputes between Singapore's ruling People Action Party and Malaysia's Alliance Party. Also, knowing that Singapore's population is predominantly Chinese, concerns arose over the Malays being outnumbered by the Chinese, so it stayed as a British Crown colony. Singapore would go on to achieve independence after the British announced that they would withdraw all forces from Southeast Asia in 1968. Military presence in Singapore concluded in October 1971 with a 5-power defense arrangement involving Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, and Singapore as partners. So now that we've seen the ongoing push for independence in Malaysia, let's dive into how these desires were finally satisfied when independence was officially granted. Surprisingly, the ordeal was relatively peaceful. Great Britain was reluctant to cede Malaya and Singapore because of the economic and strategic value that the territories provided. Malaysia was a trading hub for tin mining and rubber, while Singapore was a vital military base. This explains why the British continued to hold such a great influence in these colonies even after independence, which we'll save for later. Despite this, no war took place that would directly lead to Malaysia's independence. After the World Wars, it became clear that Britain was struggling to maintain their colonies. Economic problems riddled Britain, making running the empire unmanageable. They also realized that the British Royal Navy was not enough to suppress movements for independence. The educated freedom seekers of Malaysia decided that the best method was a formal discussion with colonial leaders. Thus, Rahman led a delegation to England to negotiate for independence. Both parties came to an agreement and independence would be granted to Malaysia, as outlined in the Malaysia Agreement. Now that Malaysia is officially free, you'd expect them to be finally independent, right? Well, that wasn't necessarily the case. You see, Great Britain was hesitant to leave behind all of Malaysia's valuable assets, so they maintained a strong economic presence following independence. They guaranteed Malaysia's security with the Defense Treaty, which was really just a way to allow the British to base troops and equipment in the region. Furthermore, the British ensured that they held economic influence over Malaya, which is evident as over 60% of Malaysian corporate assets were still owned by foreigners after independence, 2/3 of which were British controlled. On top of that, they also encouraged ethnic divides in the region. There was always an ethnicity problem in Malaysia as the British created an economy where jobs were associated with ethnicity. Chinese people were in commerce, Malays were farmers, while Indians were plantation workers. By amplifying this divide, the British were able to disrupt the peace as riots broke out in the country. But in response to the race riots, Malaysia issues the NEP, or the New Economic Policy, which eliminates the race issue and fights for economic independence from foreign entities like Britain. Now, as all of this was happening, the Cold War was going on as well. So how was Malaysia affiliated with the Cold War? Well, Malaysia had previously been threatened by communist uprisings from rebels. Recall that Japan had confiscated the trade settlements of Southeast Asia from Great Britain during World War II, but when Japan lost, these settlements were dissolved. The British established the Federation of Malaya on February 1, 1948 in an attempt to restore their authority. However, they were faced with opposition from Chinese communist rebels who began a guerrilla war. The rebels were defeated, but this incident reveals a tension from differences in ideology, the struggle for independence, and ethnic divisions between Malayan and Chinese populations. That's when New Zealand enters the picture. Given the onset of the Cold War, someone had to keep an eye on Malaysia for communist activity, so New Zealand establishes the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization designed to stop further communist activity in the region. Armed forces were sent to Singapore and Malaya, who maintained a presence until 1989. In addition to this, relations with the Soviet Union had become tense over differences in international issues. Even though both states had good economic relations prior, as Russia was a main consumer for rubber, relations deteriorated as Malaya opposed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, its role in the Vietnam War, and its intervention in the Indian Ocean. But after decades of struggle with communist rebels, an ethnic divide, and Britain's hesitation to give up Malaysia completely, Malaysia has successfully decolonized, and it has become the multicultural society with a bustling economy in Southeast Asia today.